This is Speaking Freely with the ACLU of Pennsylvania. I'm Andy Hoover, your host and Director of Communications at the ACLU of PA. In the run-up to this year's election, we here at the ACLU knew that candidates would be talking about the two issues of immigration and public safety. And as they so often do, they could be expected to talk about those issues in a way that relies on old, failed policies that are excessive on punishment, incarceration, and closing the doors of the United States. True to form, that's what candidates from both parties have done. Knowing that was coming, the ACLU has been engaged all year in a research project called Battleground Blueprint. We've deployed multiple rounds of surveys in multiple states, including Pennsylvania, to get a better look at voters' attitudes on these two issues. On this episode, we'll hear from three people who have been actively involved in this project: Ellen Flenniken, Deputy Director of the ACLU's Justice Division; Anu Joshi, National Campaigns Director on Immigration for the ACLU; and Jeff Liszt, a partner at Impact Research, the pollster that conducted the survey in Pennsylvania. Jeff, Ellen, and Anu talk about the results and what they mean for candidates, elected officials, and advocates. This conversation was recorded on September 11th. Ellen, Anu, Jeff, thank you all for joining me for this conversation. This has been a months-long project for not only the ACLU of Pennsylvania, but for the ACLU across the country. And we're talking about our Battleground Blueprint, or what we call internally Narrative Change Project. And Ellen and Anu, you've been leading this for our national organization. And Ellen, I just wanted to start with you. Explain what this project is.
Sure. Thanks so much, Andy. And we have been so grateful for your partnership and that of the ACLU of Pennsylvania on this project and so many others. And so unfortunately, we are quite familiar with the issues of crime and public safety and immigration and the border being weaponized in really harmful ways during election cycles as candidates and political strategists make the decision that approach will win them more votes. Unfortunately, this is something that has been animating the political conversation, certainly on the criminal justice side, for decades. I think everyone remembers the infamous Willie Horton ad in 1988. And frankly, we have been grappling with the fallout from that kind of political rhetoric and what it means when it translates into policy. And it's interesting that we are taping this 2 days before the 30th anniversary of the 1994 crime bill, which is on this Friday the 13th. I don't think it's an accident that it is Friday the 13th. And so I think that is such an important example of the harms that our entire country faces for decades because of choices that are made on the campaign trail rhetorically and how that translates into people's lives. And so what we have been doing at the ACLU this year is drawing on years of public opinion research that we have fielded to better understand the values and attitudes that voters hold about crime and public safety and immigration and the border, and then taking those findings into some of the most competitive battlegrounds in the country so that we can demonstrate to candidates and their campaigns that there is a path forward on these two issues that is politically strategic and good policy. And our core recommendation is that folks should champion an affirmative, solutions-driven vision on both of these issues that focuses on addressing the root causes of these problems and offering solutions rather than simply stoking fears and offering scare tactics to voters, which are not what folks are looking for. So that's the kind of core component of the project.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting that you tied it back to recent history of the Willie Horton ad and the '94 crime bill here in Pennsylvania. I was only a couple of years into my time at the ACLU of PA when the city of Hazleton tried to regulate immigration on their own. And that turned into a big lawsuit here for our team. So this anti-immigrant mentality has been chasing us around here in PA pretty much the whole 20 years I've been with the organization. Um, so Jeff, you've worked with us on the research, looking in and digging in on voters' attitudes about these two issues. You've worked with not only the ACLU of PA, but the ACLU in some other places as well. Tell us about the results. Well, first of all, tell us about the survey, what exactly you did, and then what results you found, some key results here with Pennsylvania voters.
Yep, absolutely. So in Pennsylvania, we conducted a survey of 600 likely voters in this fall's election. But then there were some communities that we were interested in that wouldn't be adequately represented in just the statewide sample. So we conducted additional interviews among Latino Pennsylvanians, Black Pennsylvanians, and Pennsylvanians in two key congressional districts that are competitive up in the Lehigh Valley. But then these are issues where often people are not all that informed about policy, and they're making decisions based on emotion. Ellen referenced how that sometimes leads candidates to embrace fear-driven narratives. And we wanted to understand what's going on under the surface for these issues. So we followed up the survey with some qualitative research so people could explain to us in their own words why these issues matter to them and how they parse them. And that was really interesting research, because one of the things that we saw, for example, on public safety was that if you ask Pennsylvanians to choose what approach they want to making the state more safe, they choose addressing the root causes of crime by about a 2-to-1 margin. 60% of Pennsylvanians say we need to invest in proven solutions to prevent crime, like affordable housing, mental health, addiction services to make our communities safer. And only 32% say we need to put 100,000 more police on the street to address crime and make our communities safer. And the qualitative research, again, helped explain some of why people would choose the proven solutions. And that reason is that people in Pennsylvania are already connecting economic opportunity, lack of access to services, mental health, addiction with public safety. Right? They're already making these connections. And that's, again, why by a 2-to-1 margin, they support the proven solutions. And you see that support for the proven solutions across demographic differences. Independent voters in Pennsylvania support the proven solutions by about 2-to-1, white, Black, and Latino Pennsylvanians and Pennsylvanians in the 7th and 8th congressional districts, right? They're all supporting the proven solutions on crime because, again, they're all already making the connection between public safety and services for communities.
So, Anu, I want to talk a little bit about what this means for stakeholders, particularly in the immigration space. So, if we're talking about advocates or candidates, elected officials, want to be elected officials, where there's talk about immigration all over our airwaves. It particularly seems to be dominating our U.S. Senate race. And so, when you looked at these findings, what do you think were the biggest takeaways from the research that Jeff's team did here in PA?
Yeah, so I want to underscore that this election is providing a new scenario for us to kind of counter, in that immigration and specifically the border, we know are really top of minds of many voters consistently across many different surveys in Pennsylvania and nationally. Voters are listing immigration as a top 1 or 2 concern, which is not something that we've seen in our recent past. I mean, going back decades, probably. And in large part, this is because we know that there are candidates, campaigns, committees that have invested hundreds of millions of dollars in anti-immigrant ads just in 2024 alone, with the explicit goal of really making average voters afraid, and pushing a fear-based narrative around the border and around immigration and immigrants in general. And so I just want to start this with acknowledging that like the terrain that we're operating on is incredibly difficult, and that at least on the issue of immigration, we're being far outspent by our opponents. And so we have an uphill battle, and that is for sure. Because we know a lot of things about immigration. Let's start with the positive. We know that voters, even amongst all of this noise and ad spending and efforts to make people afraid, that voters still overwhelmingly support a path to citizenship for undocumented longtime residents and dreamers. Like, that has been unwavering, and voters continue to demonstrate that, they really believe in that solution, that long-term residents, their neighbors, their family members, their friends, their classmates, we really need a path to citizenship. We also know that some of the worst of Trump's policies, family separation and mass deportation, are also wildly unpopular with voters, especially when you're able to talk to voters about like what that actually looks like. What does it mean to kind of enact a mass deportation? What does it mean to separate families at the border or in our communities, and the impact that that has on Pennsylvanian families? And we know, gratefully, that voters do not support those policies, especially when you put them up against other solutions that we could offer, hiring more asylum officers, hiring more immigration court judges. But I think the biggest thing that we've learned from all of the research that we did with Jeff and with others is that voters really want a balanced approach to immigration, that it can't just be all one thing or the other. We know that, yes, voters want candidates to directly acknowledge that there is a problem, that we need to manage what's going on at the border, and we need, to ensure that we are creating a fair, orderly, and humane system, and also that we have a path to citizenship for dreamers and other long-term residents. And so what we have found overwhelmingly in all of the research that Jeff has done for us, not just in Pennsylvania, but also with our other partners, is that voters want a balanced approach, and that candidates, campaigns are leaving a lot of voters on the table when they are not talking about that balanced approach.
So, Ellen, I want to ask you a similar question about public safety. I'm just one person consuming what I consume, so I can't. This is not quantitative in any way, but I'm not seeing as much conversation here in PA about criminal justice issues, at least in the campaign context. But I will say that in our largest city, we're dealing with a situation where some elected officials seem to be going back to the old ways of thinking about criminal justice policy. And yet, as Jeff said, our survey research shows that's really not what voters want. So having said that, same question for you about the results on public safety. What's your biggest takeaway from this research?
Sure. So I have to say, I've breathed a little bit of a sigh of relief this cycle, in that some of the surveys have found that crime and public safety are slightly less salient of issues than they have been previously. So for the 2022 midterms, for example, this was the core issue that was driving the debate behind the economy, really. And so that is helpful because unfortunately we are still encountering this dynamic where the conventional political wisdom is that when voters are concerned about crime, politicians need to call for more police and more jails and more prisons. And what Jeff has shared is that our research directly undermines that. The reality is that voters are hungry for solutions. They understand that we cannot arrest our way out of homelessness, out of unemployment and poverty. We need to take a different approach. Voters understand that police are not the right response to every problem. They should not be tasked with solving all social issues, that sending for example, behavioral health workers to certain mental health and drug crises is a better approach that makes communities safer and also relieves the burden on police. Those are all proposals that polled really well in Pennsylvania, as well as in our research in some of the other competitive battlegrounds across the country. I think one of the other pieces that I'll share is we have long been dealing with a situation in the world of criminal justice where facts and public perceptions are quite out of sync, we'll say. And I think that's really true this cycle in particular, where, we had in the couple of years after the onset of the pandemic, we saw increases in crime across the country. But then in 2023 in particular, crime rates began to drop precipitously, and violent crime in particular was at near 50-year lows last year. And then in the first half of 2024, we've got preliminary numbers. Those rates have continued to decline. We've also seen that property crime, for example, has declined by double digits. But none of that actually aligns with voter perceptions of what's happening. And so, in addition to this survey that we worked with Jeff and Impact Research on in Pennsylvania, we also did an earlier round of research across 6 of the most competitive battleground congressional districts across the country. 2 in California, 2 in Arizona, 1 in Ohio, and 1 in New Jersey. The thing that all 6 of those districts have in common is that President Biden won them in 2020, but 5 of the 6 districts are currently held by Republicans. So really interesting, quite competitive territory, and also a pretty kind of diverse representation geographically. And what Jeff and his team found in that research, when we asked folks if they thought that crime in their own area, so not nationally or in some faraway big city, but in their own community, if they thought it was increasing, staying about the same, or decreasing, across most demographics, voters said that crime was either increasing or staying about the same. We actually saw fewer than 1 in 10 voters who said that they believed that crime was decreasing. Now, we didn't ask this question in Pennsylvania, but we did ask it with Impact Research in Michigan in July, and very similar findings there, where only 1 in 10 voters in Michigan said they thought that crime was decreasing. And so we're dealing with kind of this situation where folks need to have their candidates and their elected officials really meet them where they are, which is this place of fear and concern, which is understandable, and that elected officials need to acknowledge those concerns without stoking fears, without spreading misinformation. And one of the things that we have recommended to candidates is that they probably shouldn't get in a back and forth fact check with their constituents or prospective constituents. But we have kind of the other major piece of this project that Anu and I have been running is to also meet with media validators across the country and to brief them on these results as well. And when I'm in those conversations, I urge them, please fact check. That is your role. And so that is something that is really important, is that you can, despite the fact that you have voters across this broad cross section of demographics who believe that crime is something that is serious in their communities, they still choose by a 2-to-1 margin, as Jeff shared, proven solutions over more police. That is what they think will make their communities safer, and that is what their candidates should offer if they want to win more votes.
Yeah, I'd like to pick up on the thread of meeting people where they are, because in this survey, as in other surveys, both of these issues, public safety and immigration, are far less important to voters than the cost of living, than inflation, than the economy, than jobs. And part of the reason that I think that the proven solutions messaging on public safety works well is that you're talking about investing in affordable housing, which is one of the main economic concerns for a lot of voters. You're talking about investing in jobs, which is one of the main economic concerns. And again, a higher concern than public safety or immigration. If you're talking about increasing funding for programs that offer support for treatment of mental health issues and drug addiction, then you're meeting people where they are on what they believe is causing crime in the first place. And then, to pick up again on a thread of something that Anu had said, we're in this media environment where the immigration conversation is very much focused on disorder at the border, chaos. And as part of that, it's very much focused on recent arrivals, on migrants. And that is where a lot of the anti-immigration advertising is pointing people's attention. But at the same time, most people believe that there are immigrants who are important members of their community, who are deeply integrated in the fabric of their community, who are longtime residents. Voters believe in fair treatment of dreamers. They believe in the pathway to citizenship, both for dreamers and for longtime residents. And so one of the most important things to do in the immigration conversation is to bring the focus back around to immigrants as essential to the fabric of our communities, to those immigrants who are contributing to our communities, and again, are deeply interwoven in our communities. And the ways in which immigrants are doing that, and it's just a different conversation, right, than what people are consuming in the media. And then again, Anu mentioned a balanced approach and how leaders are leaving voters on the table if they're not talking about that balanced approach. I think that part of the reason for that is that too many politicians are looking for a way to use immigration to sound tough, which leads them into the fear-based narratives. And not enough of them are using immigration as a way of sounding reasonable and sane to the voters, which is really one of the main things that voters are trying to figure out, right? Is who's crazy and who's reasonable and sane. And if you're at the extremes, right, you're more likely to come across as out of the mainstream in ways that are qualitative and that voters pick up on. And again, I think that the sort of both extremes on immigration risk that, and there's just been a lot of space left in the middle that politicians on both sides are leaving on the table.
Yeah, and what you said there, Jeff, about immigrants being part of the fabric of our country, that really gets into communicating through value statements and finding your shared values with your audience. Ellen talked a little bit about candidates as well as media validators and people's perceptions. And I do think there's a good lesson there for advocates as well, because sometimes we come right in with our solutions and don't acknowledge where people are or what their perceptions are. Now, that doesn't mean we linger there. We want to get them to where we want them to go. I always say, I'm not the first person to say this, but I like to say that our job is not to take the popular position. Our job is to make our position popular. But that doesn't mean if you just come right in and give your take without acknowledging what the audience's concerns are, where you're probably not going to reach them. Jeff, I wanted to ask you about the oversampling. You did mention that a little while ago. We did oversample a number of audiences. Can you talk a little bit about that and what those findings were?
Mm-hmm. Sure. I mean, one of the things that was interesting in Pennsylvania was that public safety actually registered a little bit higher on the list of concerns for voters than it has in some other states or in the Battleground research. 23% of Pennsylvania voters said that crime and public safety was either the first or second most important issue. And that, again, is still behind inflation, cost of living, jobs, the economy. But you did see more Democrats in Pennsylvania, saying that crime and public safety was a concern. You did see more independence. And part of that was something we saw in the oversampling of communities of color, and is driven by older voters in communities of color. There are a lot of concerns about public safety there. So that was one of the interesting things that we saw. But I'll come back also to the oversamples in the targeted congressional districts, because I had thought that we might see numbers in those two targeted congressional districts that were a little bit worse on both crime and public safety and immigration. But in CD7 and CD8, you still had 62 or 64% that would rather have investments in proven solutions on public safety than more police on the street. If you looked at the immigration conversation, both of those congressional districts, including 8, which is a little bit further north, a little bit, sort of out of the sort of more concentrated counties of Lehigh and Northampton. You still, and so 8 had more concern over immigration, but you still had strong response to the balanced approach language. In both of those congressional districts, there's still a lot of space in the middle to sound reasonable by talking about how we need a balanced approach that's orderly, that's fair, that's humane at the border, and that provides a pathway to citizenship.
And that's a good segue, since you said you were a little bit surprised by those results, Jeff. Good segue into my next question, which is for all of you. And Anu, we can start with you. Is there anything, what surprised you from these results?
Yeah. So first I want to say, I'm glad that Pennsylvania is trending Ellen's way on crime being more of a priority than immigration. And, I think also I do want to say one thing before I answer your question, Andy, sorry, is it's interesting too to think about, for voters who are listing immigration and border as like a top 1 or 2 concern. It's also important to know like which of those voters are voters that we're never going to get, right? Who we're never going to be able to convince that immigrants are a part of the fabric of our society, are important and integral members of our communities, and that like we need real solutions. And I think from some of the research that we've seen, it's not definitive, we've seen that it's more likely that folks who say immigration is a top 2 concern are in that outlier extreme group that Jeff was just kind of describing, that, we're never going to convince. And so we have to like acknowledge that and realize that that's not who we're talking to. And so in some ways, we're actually talking to those folks who are getting bombarded by, and I know as you are in Pennsylvania, by these hundreds of millions of dollars in ads, and also care much more about the economy and cost of living and inflation, but still want to know that their candidates, that their elected leaders have a plan, have a solution, acknowledge there's a problem. And it's a little bit of like, I hate to use this analogy, but like chicken and egg, right? If our elected leaders who are solutions oriented aren't spending time, money, investing in talking about those solutions, and voters aren't hearing about them and are only hearing from one side of the equation. And so all they know is that they should be afraid. And so, it's a little bit like the polling. Our hope, to your point, is to change how voters are hearing about the issue generally, and that can't always only follow polling. But what surprised me, so all of that, in this research that we did in the 6 battlegrounds with Jeff that Ellen mentioned, Jeff asked a kind of baseline question. Do you think immigrants today are a good thing for your community and the country, or a burden? And I was really shocked and dismayed to see that in those 6 districts, voters were basically evenly tied, 45-45. And I think even 5 years ago, we wouldn't have seen those numbers. We just had so much more goodwill. And to my point, I think people were investing in talking about how immigrants were part of our communities and how, the anti-immigrant policies of former President Trump really tore apart who we were and thought of ourselves as Americans. But even against that backdrop, where voters in these districts were tied on whether or not they thought immigrants were a good thing or a bad thing for the country, we asked, do you support a balanced approach to immigration that both manages the border and provides a path to citizenship for longtime residents and dreamers? Or do you think it's either too dangerous to open up our country to new people or too costly to open up our country to new people? And by a 2-to-1 margin, voters in those same 6 districts that aren't sure about immigrants being a burden or, a positive, chose a balanced approach over shutting off our country to new people. And so that gives me a lot of optimism, a lot of hope for the future about being able to really make this case to the American voter. But I have to admit, when I saw that first number, I was pretty shocked and happily surprised that Americans still do not want to close ourselves off. And so just wanted to, I think that for me was the most surprising.
Boy, that
I
opens
think
up.
it's
Oh, go ahead, Jeff.
I was just going to say, I think it's always important to follow up the research with some qualitative, because you learn a lot about what's going on under the surface with people and what assumptions they may be making, right, that are driving some of these opinions. One of the other questions we asked in the Battleground research was, to the extent that you've got any concerns about immigration, what are those concerns? And one of the options that people could give was, oh, immigrants are flooding our country with fentanyl. Another concern that people could offer was just that undocumented immigrants weren't following the legal pathway to enter the country. And when you follow up that kind of research with qualitative research like we did in Pennsylvania, you see that most voters believe that it is easy to immigrate in the United States through legal pathways. And it's a total misconception, right? But if you have that misconception, then you might believe that people who are undocumented, right, are choosing to do things the wrong way. Because it's so easy. Why wouldn't they just do it the right way? They should just be doing it the right way, right? So I think that is underpinning a lot of the challenges that we've got on immigration. But it's also part and parcel with the focus, the relentless media and advertising driven focus on recent arrivals and migrants, as opposed to immigrants who are longtime members deeply integrated in the fabric of our community, which is a better place for us to be having the conversation.
My thought after listening to Anu's description of those 2 results was, boy, people's views are complicated. And also they may be quite malleable too. You can really see how people are influenced one way or the other. They really want to believe in the good thing, but they can be very easily swayed over to the bad idea and the dark idea. So it is, I think it says a lot about not only us as advocates, but elected officials and candidates, how important what they say is, and how that influences the audiences that are listening. Ellen, what about you? Is there anything particular that surprised you from these results?
Yeah, sure. So I will first share a little bit of context and part of the motivation for why we decided to embark on this project, which was, the past couple of years have been quite challenging in the world of criminal legal reform, and in DC and state houses across the country. What we've been hearing from legislators is that they know that some of the bills that they are passing are not necessarily the best policy, that they are not addressing the root causes of the things that voters say they're concerned about. So, for example, homelessness. The solution to homelessness is to ensure that there's affordable housing and that people can have housing. It's not to arrest people and saddle them with criminal records, make it harder for them to get a job and to get housing. And yet, what we're seeing is kind of this growing carceral criminal approach because of a political calculus that they believe that it is necessary for them to pass these bills in order to maintain a majority, protect their caucus, win re-election in some of these key battlegrounds. And so one of the things that we did, not in the research with Jeff, but in YouGov surveys earlier this year across nationally and then across 4 of the most competitive battlegrounds. So Georgia, Arizona, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, was we tried to emulate a campaign environment where we took 2 different candidate statements and put them head to head and asked the voters to choose which statement they preferred. So we first started with the survey in April, where we tested a single tough Republican statement against 2 different versions of Democratic statements. Our solutions Democrat, who uplifts the approach that Jeff and I have been sharing today, or the tough Democrat, who is frankly basically indistinguishable from the Republican candidate. It just simply says, the Democratic candidate says at the start of the message. And so what we found nationally was that when the tough Republican and the tough Democrat went head to head, the tough Dem lost by 8 points. But when the tough Republican went up against a solutions Democrat in this survey, the solutions Dem won by 10 points. So we saw this 18-point swing. And the findings were similar in the battlegrounds. The solutions Dem won across all 4 of the battlegrounds. In Arizona, for example, it was also an 18-point swing where the solutions Dem won by 4, but the tough Dem lost by 14. But now I'll get to the thing that I actually found most surprising in all of the research, which is we, as the ACLU, as a nonpartisan organization, we decided to test the inverse. So the following month, we went back into the field with a national survey with YouGov and tested a single tough Democratic statement against 2 different versions of a Republican. Solutions Republican. Turns out it was the exact same statement we tested for the Dems, just it said the Republican candidate says, and then a tough Republican. And so when a tough Dem and tough Republican went head to head, basically the same result as with the previous survey. The tough Dem lost by 7. When the solutions Republican went up against the tough Democrat, nationally, the solutions Republican won by 33 points, which for anyone who does polling, who's familiar with what national polling typically looks like, that is an astounding result. And I think it really gets to the heart of these findings, which is that people want their elected officials to be problem solvers. They actually want them to address the root causes of the issues that they're facing. They want solutions. As far as, campaign strategy, I'm a strategist. And one of the very first things you learn when you are running a candidate campaign is that you need to draw contrast between the 2 candidates. And so tough versus tough doesn't draw that contrast. But if you have solutions, problem solver, prevention instead of punishment against tough, that problem solver is offering something that sounds more reasonable and more effective. And regardless of party, it's more persuasive to voters.
Well, thank you all for joining me for this conversation. This is great. I know this work is going to go on. When you first approached us about it, much of the pitch was pointed toward the 2024 election and getting candidates to speak a certain way. But part of our conversation was this research is going to be really helpful for next year. And it's not like these issues are going to go away, regardless of who wins the elections, state house, state senate, president, Congress. We're still going to be dealing with them. So we're going to I understand there may even be some more research in the works, Ellen, ahead in the next year or so. So
we just can't get enough of it. I mean, one of the things that's been so amazing about this project, and it frankly gives me goosebumps. I mean, one of the reason that I came to the ACLU and wanted to work here is because of the power and potential of having affiliates all across the country. And what has been extraordinary here is we've had over 20 affiliates engaged in this project, partnering with us to meet with congressional candidates on both sides to share these results and to offer this path forward. And now that we're moving beyond the election phase and after November, preparing for 2025 legislative sessions, I'm really looking at how do we continue to demonstrate at a local level in all of these states, not just battlegrounds, but purple states, blue states, red states across the country, that these policy proposals have broad and deep support, and that elected officials don't need to fear championing them and passing those bills because they are facing re-election in 2 years. And so I think indeed this work will continue in 2025 and beyond.
One old lobbyist friend said to me once that these guys, meaning the legislators, aren't really going to be moved until they know it's going to affect them at the polls. So that's why this work is so important, to show them where voters are. As much regard as I have for all of us as advocates, our word alone isn't enough. They need to see that this is where voters are. So it's really important work, and I'm glad you're all doing it. And thanks for taking the time to talk today.
Thank you
Thanks,
so
Andy.
much.
Thanks, Andy.
That's Ellen Flenniken and Anu Joshi of National ACLU and Jeff Liszt of Impact Research. You can find more information about the PA portion of this project at aclupa.org/solutions. And you can see more on the ACLU's research around the country at aclu.org/Battleground Blueprint. If you enjoy speaking freely, please rate and review us on your podcast app of choice. That's how people find the show. And share our podcast content on social media. Our handle on all the platforms is at ACLUPA. That brings episode 88 to a close. The editor of Speaking Freely is Natalie Montero. Our opening theme is by Moody Finn, and our closing theme is by Elliot. Both are courtesy of bensound.com. The executive director of the ACLU of Pennsylvania is Mike Lee. I'm Andy Hoover. Until next time, be free.